let's get started with some people joining us online, and you've got this microphone.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Wow,
well,
this is like
so
professional.
it's really-
CBS News.
When you can have your podcast, we'll all
This
go
is
on
awesome.
that.
It's a prop, so that I feel like Johnny Carson back there.
Bob, did you get it?
Don't
Bob?
start
Okay.
telling jokes.
Don't get
Yeah.
us raunchy.
And the reason we got this is because a lot of times people will have good comments during the thing, and people on that are listening you can't hear. So hopefully this
Patty will get you
will
hooked up.
help with that.
Yeah, don't have it in the chocolate though.
So with that, let me get started. I've got a couple of articles I want to go through. I can figure out a way to read this thing. There's just so much. There's just so much going on. It really is. Rick and I were talking earlier that it's just so hard to keep up with things. One of the things that we mention frequently is what we read in Revelation chapter 6, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I don't think I need to review that, but one of the things that we know is going to happen very early during the tribulation, very early on, after the Antichrist makes his appearance on the scene, is that there's going to be an explosion of famine, likely caused by hyperinflation, food shortages, and so forth. And we know that we have this ongoing issue with the supply chain and so on. But I came across a couple of articles that give us a little more insight into this whole food shortage thing. I'm going to start with one that's entitled Farming Insider warns that the coming food shortages are worse than we are being told.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Doesn't surprise me.
And I wish that there was good news, but there really isn't. And this is a pretty important article, and I think it's one that we probably should pay attention to. I'm not saying we go out and store up food or anything like that, but we all have to make our own decisions when it comes to that. But let me just read the highlights of this particular article. It starts out, the information I'm about to share with you is extremely alarming, but I've always endeavored to never sugarcoat things for my readers. Right now, there are shortages of certain items in grocery stores across the United States, and food supplies have gotten tight all over the globe. I have repeatedly warned that this is just the beginning, but I didn't realize how dire things have already gotten until I received an email from a farming insider that I have corresponded with over the years. I asked him if I could publicly share some of his information, and he said it would be okay as long as I kept his name out of it. According to this farming insider, I don't know if he's what he is, if he's a farmer or whatever, but dramatically increased costs for fertilizers. We've talked a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a shortage of urea around the globe, which is what is used to make fertilizer, and it's already, the cost has already tripled. And that's really what is driving a lot of the concern. According to this farming insider, dramatically increased costs for fertilizer will make it impossible for many farmers to profitably plant corn this year. You think about corn and how it's used for so many different things, you know, and many of the foods that we buy and feed for
the alcohol for the gas.
Huh?
The alcohol for the gas.
Right, that's another thing. Things for 2022 are interesting and scary. Input costs for things like fertilizer, liquid nitrogen, and seeds are like triple and quadruple the old prices. It will not be profitable to plant this year. Let me repeat, the economics will not work. Our plan is to drop about 700 acres of corn off and convert to soybeans. Everybody that is in the farming business is converting to soybeans, and I don't know what you can use that stuff for. They use less fertilizer and also have chicken manure. We also have chicken manure from that operation. Guess what? We are not the only ones with those plans. Already there is a shortage of soybean seeds, so we will see how that will work out. The way I see it, there will be a major grain shortage later in the year, especially with corn. I mean, we are small with that. What about those people in the Midwest who have like 10,000 acres of corn? This will not be good. As for the farming, I see it getting bad. Things like fertilizer and liquid nitrogen have tripled and quadrupled in price, yet commodity prices are up. But that certainly won't cover the new increased input costs. We are in North Carolina, so while certainly not like the Midwest, we still grow grain. The Midwest, of course, will have these same higher input costs as well. So naturally, if the price of fertilizer is 3, 4, 5 times higher, then that's going to have an impact on the costs at the store, if they can even produce it. And I think I mentioned last week that China is currently hoarding like 69% of the world's maize and 60% of the world's wheat and barley for whatever reason. The way I see it is a corn shortage will come. I guess there could possibly be a glut of soybeans, but remember that could depend on the seed being available. I guess there are other alternatives, maybe milo, oats, or barley. Of course, the corn market is much larger. Think animal feed and ethanol. I mean, for animals, soybeans are used too, but it's a mix. What happens to the animal producers who depend on a reasonably priced corn? I just don't see how it can end well. I mean, if we end up with plenty of soybeans, even a glut, then you have a busted market for that. I don't know, there just isn't much history to base any of this on. This has never happened before, at least in our country. I just see it hurting both grain farmers and animal farmers, and also translating to more shortages in price increases for consumers who buy the end products. And so the author says, I was stunned when I first read that. Corn is one of the foundational pillars of our food supply. If you go to the grocery store and start reading through the ingredients of various products, you will quickly discover that corn is in just about everything in one form or another. So what is our country going to look like if a severe corn shortage actually happens? I don't even want to think about that. Of course, fertilizer prices are not just going through the roof here in the United States. In South America, high fertilizer prices are going to dramatically affect coffee production. That's the one that scares me the most. Christian Ribeiro de Valle, who comes from a long line of coffee growers in Brazil, is this year paying 3 times what she paid last year for the fertilizer she needs. Coupled with a recent drought that hit her crop hard, it means Ms. de Valle, 75, will produce a fraction of her Ribeiro de Valle brand of coffee, some of which is exported. There's also a shortage of fertilizer. This year you pay, then put your name on a waiting list, and the supplier delivers it when he has it, she says. And I suppose could say if he has it. If you drink coffee in the morning, you will soon be paying much more for that privilege. Over in Africa, fertilizer prices could result in 30 million metric tons less food produced. Fertilizer demand in sub-Saharan Africa could fall 30% in 2022, according to the International Fertilizer Development Center, a global nonprofit organization. That would translate to 30 million metric tons less food produced, which the center says is equivalent to the food needs of 100 million people. Lower food or fertilizer use will inevitably weigh on food production and quality, affecting food availability, rural incomes, and the livelihoods of the poor, said Josef Schimdenbauer, Deputy Director of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization's Trade and Markets Division. Where in the world are we going to get enough food to replace the food needs of 100 million people? This is beyond serious. Basically, the stage is being set for the sort of historic global crisis that I have been relentlessly warning about. Many Americans had assumed that even if the rest of the world was suffering, we would be immune. I think we probably all tend to think that. Everything's just gonna get back to normal and everything's gonna be okay. But now there are widespread shortages all over the nation. And Wall Street Journal just published a major article entitled, U.S. Food Supply is Under Pressure from Plants to Store Shelves. This is really happening. In Washington, D.C., residents are being instructed to, quote, just buy what you need and leave some for others. If you're, quote, if you're hitting the grocery store to prepare for winter weather, please just buy what you need and leave some for others. You may have noticed empty shelves in some stores due to national supply chain issues, but there is no need to buy more than you normally would. What would have been unimaginable just a few years ago is now making headlines on a daily basis. Of course, it isn't just our food supply that's under threat. As Victor Davis Hanson, he's a very well-known thinker,
The Heritage
has aptly
Foundation.
noted, our country is now in the process of undergoing a systems collapse. In modern times, as in ancient Rome, several nations have suffered a systems collapse. The term describes the sudden inability of once prosperous populations to continue with what had ensured the good life as they knew it. Abruptly, the population cannot buy or even find once plentiful necessities. They feel their streets are unsafe. Well, that's going to be the case in the United States. Laws go unenforced or are enforced inequitably. Every day things stop working. The government turns from reliable to capricious, if not hostile. A lot of people are going to be caught off guard by the pace of change. Things are shifting so rapidly that it's really hard to keep up with all of it unless you are paying very close attention. Now that you've been exposed to the information in this article, please don't go back to sleep. This is not a drill. So,
Ooh, nice ending.
kind of a gloomy thing, but true.
Bob, can I make a statement? I've talked to Cisco today, and I talked to Bazzuto's. And we in the hotel, you have certain guidelines that you have to serve certain products. They can't get them. So we have to change a lot of the things that we're servicing, supplying, because the chain is not providing them with the product. And Cisco is massive. If you know Cisco system,
Oh, yeah.
just massive. They supply everything to everybody, and so does Bazzuto's. And Bazzuto's is having a very, very difficult time as well. We can't get shampoo.
Oh,
We can't get soaps. Everything is back ordered.
I'm bringing my own.
Well, we have a supply because we're sharing with our hotels. We have 52 hotels that we own, so we're sharing. But the deal is you can't get them. So we're ordering like massive amounts to be delivered in 6 months. It's crazy. You can't get mattresses. You cannot get mattresses. They're making them to order, and you order them, and then they'll complete your order. They have nothing in stock.
Oh, my goodness.
We just ordered
It's-
some new
it's
windows.
amazing.
Yeah. We just ordered some new windows for our place in Florida, and they tell us they won't be delivered until September or October.
Yep,
Wow.
yep. Yeah. It's we're seeing it right here,
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
We're experiencing it, and we're just
It's only
having
gonna
to,
get worse.
yeah,
Okay,
No,
here's an article along the same lines. This is entitled, Global Nitrogen Fertilizer Shortage Causing Farmer Frenzy. And speaking of shortages, and I put a note here that I just read today, this is on another issue, that the Ford Motor Company is cutting out 8 of its factories because of the chip shortages.
Oh my God.
And of course, a lot of those chips that we are so dependent on come from Taiwan.
Yeah.
And so that in and of itself is another issue. Chips are used in everything, from your phones to your automobiles. And so here's Ford shutting down or reducing the amount of production at 8 of their plants. So in terms of the global nitrogen, we have experienced countless shortages throughout the pandemic. One that's impacting farmers right now is a lack of nitrogen fertilizer. News 10, this is a News 10 whatever, wherever it is, met up with a farmer in Corey, Indiana to find out why this is happening. Nitrogen fertilizers started increasing last fall. This is due to a number of factors: supply issues, reduction in production, and the price of natural gas rising, to name a few. He said, Dwight Ludwig tells News 10 it's been difficult to get his hands on the product. We saw prices going up and they just haven't stopped. It's been all winter long. We've watched them. Prices have doubled, even more than doubled in some cases. On his farm, Ludwig uses Andorras ammonia. Last year he was paying $600 per ton. This year he's looking at $1,520 per ton. Now you may be wondering why nitrogen fertilizer is such a hot commodity for farmers. Well, simply put, it helps to grow a good-looking and healthy corn crop. As we all know in Indiana, corn is our thing. You can grow corn without it, but you're not going to grow anything like what people are used to seeing around here. It will be short with not very much corn on it. Farmers have started to look at alternatives such as animal waste, but it's not user-friendly. Manure is harder to put on the ground and it's harder for plants to absorb. Ludwig says the shortage may force farmers like himself to switch from corn to soybeans. I mean, how many uses are there for soybeans? He said that the decision they'll have to make in the next couple of weeks. People are going to be sitting down, looking at different financial numbers to see where their best bet is to go, whether it will be paying a high price for the fertilizer or moving away from corn and going to soybean. In turn, that means much less corn to feed livestock, which will increase the price of meat. Ludwig wants people to know that farmers didn't quit farming during the pandemic. They are suffering from the same supply issues as everybody else. That's why you're seeing the bare shelves at your local grocery stores. Farmers are still working every day, and we haven't missed a beat. It's just trying to get it to your dinner table is where we run into the problem. Farmers will be applying this high-priced fertilizer this spring, so it's not affected grocery prices yet, but it will. So just another thing that's affecting the supply chain and food prices and really leading toward fulfillment of Revelation 6. Here's a couple of articles dealing with moving toward, we talked a little bit about digital currency and how cash is going to become obsolete as time goes on. This is first steps, Fed moving closer to creating U.S. digital currency. The Federal Reserve has released a long-awaited review for the potential for creating a central bank digital currency, or CBDC. The report represents a significant first step in moving forward with the concept and is now through a public review period where people will be invited to respond to questions put forward in the report. From the moment Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies first emerged, sold as an independent alternative medium of exchange outside the financial status quo, it was only a matter of time before this new alternative would be absorbed, modified, and redeployed. And the reason we talk about this is that it seems very obvious that digital currency, getting away from cash, is ultimately going to lead to this one world economic system. That Antichrist, when he's comes on the scene, will have one currency that everybody in the world will be using. For those who have never heard of them, central bank digital currencies are exactly what they sound like, digitized versions of the pound, dollar, euro, etc., issued by central banks. Anybody listen to Jan Markell a couple of weeks ago with the economist that was on there?
Yeah.
And how he's predicting within 3 years, we will probably have a digital system.
Yeah.
And what he says, and again, I just listen, I don't necessarily know much about this stuff, but he's saying that when it's time to convert what we have, our cash, our securities, whatever, that each of us have in savings, is that they'll actually close the banks for a period of 2 to 3 weeks, during which they'll convert everything we have into this digital currency. And he said that people that think that, well, I'll just keep a stash of cash because, I'll just use it once everything's said and done, it's not going to work. That cash will no longer be of any value. And we know that in Sweden is now cashless. In many other countries, like China has the digital yuan, and Great Britain is experimenting with the digital pound. And so all of these nations, including, and this really wasn't something that the Fed had talked too much about until just recently. They were not showing an interest, but now they are. Now they're saying they're going to study converting at least part of what our economy is based on, from hard assets to digital. The countries where the idea of digital currency has progressed the furthest are China and the United Kingdom. The Chinese digital yuan has been in development since 2014 and is subject to ongoing and widespread testing. The United Kingdom is nowhere near that stage yet, but Chancellor Rishi Sunak is keenly pushing forward a digital pound that the press are calling Britcoin. Countries, including New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Malaysia, are not far behind. The proposals for how these CBDCs might work should be enough to raise red flags even in the most trusting of minds. Most people wouldn't like the idea of monitoring all spending in real time, but that's not the worst of it. By far the most dangerous idea is that any future digital currency should be, quote, programmable, meaning that people issuing the money would have the power to control how it's spent. That's not an interpretation or conspiracy theory. Here is a quote from Augustin Carstens, head of the Bank for International Settlements, speaking earlier this year. Quote, the key difference with the CBDC is that the central bank would have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability, and then have the technology to enforce it. The transformation of other people's money into an expression of their liability, and so consider it only right that they control it. I won't read any more of this, but this is what Antichrist has to do. He's going to control. Remember in the during the tribulation at the midpoint, when he takes over and as we'll see, breaks his covenant with Israel, then he is going to expect to be worshipped as though he's God, and he's going to implement the mark of the beast, which will be a one world monetary system. And people will need to take, if they want to buy or sell anything, they need to take the mark. And otherwise, you won't be able to buy or sell. Now, for those of us in this room that know Jesus Christ and those that are listening that know Jesus, we don't have to worry about it, because the rapture will precede the tribulation. We'll be long gone. But for those left behind, Patty, will be long gone.
I know, I can't do
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
When is it?
We don't
That's
know.
the $1 million
knew.
question. Aren't they even doing it now?
Yeah.
Starting here in the United States with the IRS and
Yeah,
what they've
you know.
started with this facial recognition, and I
Yeah.
mean, they're sneaking it in
They
here
already
too.
have it.
Well, they
Yeah,
dropped,
they're-
they
We
dropped
already
the
have it.
facial recognition
dropped it,
program though,
yeah.
because they realized it was just too full of
Yeah.
holes.
Yeah.
And then
Um,
everything
the
else.
opportunity
Yeah,
for wrongdoing was
Yeah.
huge, and so they walked away from it. I think is
But they wanna do some parts of that.
They do want, the administration has recommended that when you file your taxes, you have to do a facial recognition. That you have to use the facial scanning or whatever
This year for the
in
first
order
year?
to file taxes.
No, not this year.
They're
Under the
doing it this
idea
year.
that that'll ensure that money is, going. In the States, many people in this country are beginning to push back. And those that are behind the scenes, they know that they can only push us so far.
Yeah.
And so, that's not necessarily the case in other countries, but the United States, where we're, a capitalist, or at least we have been, free market society, that they know they can only push us so far, which says, number one, I think they'll have to figure out a way to maintain the control that they've built up. And something more sinister and more serious may be coming down the road, so who knows?
can I say, they got voice recognition already. I called one of my accounts and they recognized my voice.
Yeah.
And it's already in
Yeah.
play.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I'm working with Shirley, did you know she's a fabulous agent?
No.
Yeah, because I had
Secret
this, no, I just had this ridiculous quote, I had to go to her for advice, so I'm giving you a little plug,
Oh,
I'm
thank
sorry,
you
but
very
that's
much.
okay. Yeah, car and house and all that, her. But anyway, one of the questions, cause I was trying to do it myself, on there was, will you allow us to track you? Because they'll track how your driving is. They ask you those questions and how many times you brake, how fast you go and so forth, and you get a discount if you comply. They're tracking, so you give them that
State
authority,
farm.
they're tracking everything you have, everything you're doing.
Everything Antichrist needs, and understand that all this tracking and all this stuff is a precursor to the mark of the beast, because how else is he going to control? There's not enough people in the world to be able to monitor the entire world's population at that time, so they need the artificial intelligence, they need the technology to be able to do it.
Yeah,
So everything we're seeing now, none of it's the mark of the beast, because there's no beast, and he's not gonna make the appearance for a period of time, but what we're seeing now is a precursor, or is a foreshadowing of that time. So, and I think the technology, like Tom Hughes has said, the technology that Antichrist needs now is already there.
Rick and I
Just
watched
needs to be
one of Tom
fine-tuned.
Hughes's episodes with a pastor who talked about artificial intelligence, and that was very scary.
Yeah,
And that opens the whole door wide open to the mark of the beast.
right.
Billy Cronin, yeah.
Billy Crone,
It's-
yeah.
It would, you know,
Okay, I'm gonna skip over this next article. I'd like to read it, but it could have ramifications.
Can't afford those.
Can't afford that.
yeah.
All right, so any questions, comments? So much going on, John.
Hey, a couple comments. A few years ago, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago now, I came across a demonstration video, it was a picture really, that was taken with this really expensive camera. It was something new that had been developed, and I can't remember how many megapixels or how much it cost, but it was really expensive. And it was like one meg to prove the concept at that point. And they took a picture of a crowd of people that was like, something like close to 1 million people, you know, like in the streets. And it was blocks and blocks and blocks, just a sea of people. And when you looked at the picture, the first image that you saw of the picture, like for example on your phone, all you saw was just a blur, because there were so many people, so many faces. But you could drill down and, expand the picture.
Zoom, zoom,
You
zoom.
could see in detail every face in that crowd. If they were looking anywhere near the camera,
Yeah.
you could see every face. You could pick out every person in that crowd.
Wow.
Imagine facial recognition now being connected with that.
Yeah,
And that was a
Well,
few years ago.
China-
So for sure, this is already being
Yeah.
used in many places. We just don't know about it.
yeah. China,
They
Your phone
used that
cameras.
with the invasion of
I mean, the details
of the
now.
Capitol.
to find
Sure.
They
details.
did that.
Well, I don't know if it was that.
Phones on,
that-
the
that-
cameras on your phones now.
I don't know,
How
but
powerful
that's,
of a
The
camera.
detail.
Right, that
That's how they did
that's
it.
Phenomenal.
exactly right.
yeah, that's how they did it.
January.
Never
Yep.
mind, they could take a picture.
Well,
of the
they
space
use
station.
facial recognition now as part of the social credit system in China. They can pick out one individual out of a crowd of 100,000 in like a millisecond. So it's there, the technology's there.
You know, right shortly after 9/11, New York City, well, lots of cities around the world, but New York City started installing cameras all over the city. You could hardly move in New York City now without being picked up on a camera and recorded.
Yeah.
You know, I don't imagine they save all that for a long period of time, but if they wanna go back a few days or a week or a month, I'm sure they can do that to pick out who was walking on that corner at that moment in time. This is stuff that wasn't there
Yeah.
before 9/11.
And probably the most important item that was revealed or occurred in the past week that some of you may heard about is that some of the economic sanctions against Iran, it's a result of Iran saying they're not going to get back to the negotiating table in, where is it, Vienna, Austria, where they're doing that? Until we lift some of the sanctions, most of which are financial, economic, and had been put in place by the 45th president. And what it successfully did, is it really brought Iran to its knees in terms of their ability to do anything. And so now, the sanctions are being lifted. I don't know all the details. There's a lot of information out there that needs to be studied. But from what I understand, even with the sanctions that have been lifted, that Iran is saying that all of them, there's still sanctions in place, have to be lifted in order for them to get to the negotiating table, which is the nuclear program that the Obama administration, along with several other nations in Iran, had entered into. It's a total sham. It will never work. You cannot, I hate to say this, but you cannot trust Iran. And it puts Israel, by doing this, in the worst position imaginable. Because Israel has made it very clear that they will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. And you get mixed reports. We've been hearing these reports for years, but mixed reports that Iran is already on the verge of having enough enriched uranium to build a bomb, and could do so in a very short period of time. They don't necessarily have the ability to carry the payload, but they're working on that too. You know, the missiles and the rockets they need. And so here's Israel basically being sold down the river by our administration. And there's a price to be paid for that. That is, that's like sticking our finger in God's eye, because it puts the Jewish people in Israel under a tremendous amount of pressure. And they have to do something. They cannot sit back and allow Iran to have nuclear capabilities. So, I don't know if anybody listened to Amir, but when he gave that update, and Rick had told me about it, and so I looked at it, and I don't know, he sounded dejected to me. You don't usually hear Amir Sarfati dejected, but he sounded not defeated, because you would never defeat him, but I think the news really kind of set him back a
Is
little
that the
bit.
one in Hawaii?
No, he's
The one that he
from
was in
Israel.
Hawaii?
When he was
Yeah.
in Hawaii.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
And he's an Israeli citizen. Got a huge ministry all over the world. So, it's just one more thing. And if you think about the food supplies and here we are under the 46th administration that has stopped our ability to produce enough oil. We were energy independent a year and a half ago. And now we're asking for foreign nations to help us to supply because of decisions, I think, that were against our national security and against the people of this country.
You know, we had talked earlier about people having enough. I read an article today that the oil producers have had enough. They're actually starting, the expectation is that they're starting to gear back up to start drilling more wells.
Yeah.
And so they're, I think we're starting to see a reaction against decisions that have been forced on us, and that's gonna result in some very interesting scenarios that are
Yeah,
gonna be
yeah.
coming
Even
at
like
us.
the truckers?
Well, the truckers is another one,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, what's going on in Canada is nuts.
And they got a
right
raw
now.
deal.
Urea shortage is used in diesel fuel.
Yep. It's
And-
added for the new trucks for
Yeah, the
the,
newer trucks, what, after
for the emissions.
2017, is it?
thereabouts.
Yeah, that they require, I don't know if it's but anyway.
It's to clean the catalytic converter.
Exactly.
And
And
emission
that they were
system.
saying in Australia, there was a thing I had heard not too long ago, that Australia might not have any trucks on the road within the next few months, because apparently they must have, their fleet must be mostly newer
And the
trucks.
uses this, and it uses quite a bit. So, you know, they're at a lot of the diesel stations now, the truck stops and stuff, they have pumps for diesel fuel and they have pumps there for the diff. That's how much, they're not using a 5-gallon bucket every 100, you know, every so many miles. They're using quite a bit.
All right, so with all that good news, let's get at key chapters, and I wanna go through tonight. Go through tonight, chapter 7 of Daniel. All right. I think you'll find it to be pretty amazing. So, Daniel 7 is the most comprehensive summary Nebuchadnezzar saw was a statue. But this image, or the vision that Daniel has, according to God, we'll see that these same empires that he identifies are referred to as beasts, B-E-A-S-T-S. And so it's the same nations, but a different interpretation. God looks at world empires. He looks at the world system, whatever that system may be, as evil. And the reason he looks at them as evil is because they are under the control of Satan. Remember that when Jesus went up on the mountain and was tempted by Satan, one of the things that Satan said was that if Jesus would bow down to him, he would give him control of all the world's empires. And Satan, or Jesus, didn't rebuke him for that. He rebuked him for tempting him, but he didn't rebuke him for that. So in other words, he confirmed that the world is under the control of Satan. And we see that outlined in talks about the Mede-Persian Empire, and now it goes back, it kind of reverts back about 14 years in chapter 7 to back to the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar at this point in time had obviously died, and the Babylonian Empire was beginning to deteriorate and was ultimately going to be overtaken. But it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, so it was Nebuchadnezzar, now Belshazzar's in charge, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. So the 4 winds in the Hebrew generally means spirits. So there's some kind of spiritual, 4 spirits or 4 spiritual beings or whatever that are stirring up the sea. And the great sea, and we see that confirmed in Revelation 13, the same thing. The great sea represents nations or people. It's a representation of Gentile nations. And so this great sea that is being churned up by the 4 winds of heaven are the nations of the world. And if you keep your finger there, and if you could just, we're going to go back and forth between these 2 chapters, but if you go to Revelation 13, you'll see at the very beginning of 13 it says, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. Again, he's overlooking the world's populations. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea, out of Gentile nations. And so here we see the same reference to the sea, and what it does is it represents the nations of the world. So in Revelation 13, the beast that is referred to in chapter 1 is a clear reference to Antichrist. And we see here it had 7 horns, or 10 horns, and 7 heads. So the horns represents power, so that's a representation of the 10 nations or 10 regions of the world or whatever is in place at that time. There won't be 9, there won't be 11, there'll be 10 nations that will control the world, out of which Antichrist will come, and 7 heads. So this is also the 7 horns more likely refers to, or 10 horns refers to the leaders who have power. Horn is generally symbolized in the scriptures as power. And then 7 heads, which are 7 nations with 10 crowns on its head. So what we see here is that it starts out, he has control over 10 horns or 10 nations, and 3 of those likely were defeated in some fashion, and they resisted originally. So we see the same analogy or the same metaphor to the sea in Revelation 13 as we do in Daniel chapter 7. So coming out of the great sea, 4 great beasts. And remember in Daniel 2, these beasts were referred to as the components of the statue, the head of gold, the chest and upper body parts of silver, bronze, and then the legs of iron. 4 beasts, each different from the other, came up out of the sea. So this is a vision that Daniel has of 4 empires that will be in existence right up until the time of Jesus Christ. The first was like a lion, and if you go through, in different places like in Isaiah and other places, you'll see that Babylon was often referred to as a lion, and at the entrance to Babylon, into the city of Babylon, they actually had 2 lions with wings depicted on top of those lions. So the first was like a lion and it had the wings of an eagle. So it's a clear representation, and Daniel gets a clarification of that later. And I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. So the wings of the lion depict speed and the ability at which it went through and conquered the known world. So the removal of the wings probably indicates a reduction or a lessening of that empire's mobility or ability to do what it did. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. Now, some people will teach that this is a representation of the Russian bear. It's not. That's a false notion. And the bear, which is not as powerful, it's still very powerful, not as powerful as the lion. So we see declining power here. That the bear was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth. And as we'll see later, the bear is a representation of the Mede-Persian Empire, and the 3 ribs, most scholars believe, are 3 prior empires that it conquered, probably Egypt, Babylon, and Lydia. So when the Mede-Persians had their power, which lasted about 200 years, that they were the world's known empire. It was told to get up and eat your fill of flesh. After that, after the Babylonian Empire, which was supplanted or defeated by the Mede-Persian Empire, after that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, which represents swiftness or speed. And that is a clear representation of Alexander the Great. And if you look over in chapter 8, you see that I think it's in, well, let's think about this and go to this as, in verse 5 of chapter 8. Let's go to verse 6. It came toward the two-horned ram. This is the Greek Empire going after the two-horned ram, which is the Medes and the Persians. I had seen standing beside the canal and charged in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously. This is a picture of the Greek Empire striking and defeating the two-horned ram, which is Mede and Persia, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. In other words, that was it for the Medes and the Persians. The ram was powerless to stand against it. In other words, under Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire easily defeated after 200 years, which is about the length of time for an empire to exist. Rome is a bit of an exception, but most empires don't exist or last much more than 200 or 200 or so years. And in its place, four prominent horns grew up toward the four winds of heaven. Out of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in its power to the south and to the east of the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled them. So, actually, if I go back up to verse 3 is where I wanted to start, actually. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, which means that the Persian part of the empire was stronger than the Medes. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue it from its power. It did as it pleased. As I was thinking about it, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the east, crossing the whole world, the whole earth, without touching the ground. That is a clarification or a depiction or another way of describing the leopard. He went through with great speed, which was a reference to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is the one that is referenced in Daniel 8 down through verse 5 or 6. So he is the leopard, and we know that from history, the Greek Empire conquered the known world at that time with great speed. Alexander the Great was considered to be one of the most brilliant military leaders in history, and he was the leopard. Unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but he passed away at a very young age. And rather than, as leaders generally did, leaving his kingdom to family members, he deeded his kingdom to four military leaders, which is what is said here. On its back it had four wings like those of a bird. This beast had four heads, and it was given authority to rule. So that's a picture of Alexander the Great, who, after he died, made it clear that his kingdom would be under the rulership of four military leaders, which has been confirmed in history. So bear in mind that all of this is being prophesied before it actually occurred, before Greece came into the picture. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast. This is a reference to Rome. So Greece came about roughly, Alexander the Great started his campaign in roughly 330 BC, and it lasted till 63 BC when the Roman Empire took over. Terrifying and frightening and very powerful. And so we know from history that the Roman Empire was ruthless, and they took great pride in the number of victories it had, and that's gets to the fact that it had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Now, the Roman Empire lasted probably some 500 years, but ultimately the Roman Empire just kind of came apart. It was never defeated. It fell under the weight of its own immorality and just ceased to exist. But they were never defeated militarily, which is why we see this picture of different from all the other beasts, and it had 10 horns. At no time in history did the Roman Empire consist of 10 entities or 10 nations or 10 parts. So what this is a description of something that so far has never existed. But we know that the Bible's true, which means that at some point in time it will exist. This is a reference to the 10-member nation, be they nations or regions or whatever, that will comprise the known world when Antichrist comes on the scene. So, you know, I think it's probably along the lines of the European Union and maybe whatever's left of the United States as part of. I think it's got to be regions. I don't think it's 10 nations. It could be, but whatever it is, it's going to be 10. And so this is a prophecy from the Roman Empire. This is where we get the term. We often hear the term revived Roman Empire. This is where it comes from. That while the Roman Empire has not existed for 1,500 plus years, it is in some form going to come back to life. I mean, Hitler, that was what Hitler's goal was to revive the Roman Empire over which he was going to be the ruler. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me came another horn, a little one. We talked about this last week. The little horn coming out from the 10 horns, out from these 10 nations or 10 regions, whatever they may be, is the little horn. That's one of the 33 different biblical titles given to Antichrist. So he's the little horn. He is going to come on the scene very small, insignificant, inconspicuous, but yet by the time he grows into full power during the tribulation, he is going to rule the entire world. He's going to make Adolf Hitler and Mao Zedong and Pol Pot, every ruthless leader in history, look like choir boys, and he is going to control the entire world. But he's going to come on the scene insignificant, very, you know, he's going to have great oratory skills. He's going to have great charisma. He's going to convince the world, which is in chaos at the time, that he's got all the answers. And oh, by the way, when this occurs, when he does come on the scene, the church has to be gone, because he cannot be revealed, as we learn in 2 Thessalonians, until the church is gone. And so when he comes on the scene, the church is gone. And there's going to be, imagine, who knows how many millions and millions of people just suddenly disappear. And he's going to come on the scene, and world leaders and those that are left behind are just going to be in total chaos. I mean, this is at the point when inflation is reached worldwide levels that we see in Argentina or other places over the years, rampant hyperinflation, death, destruction, all kinds of things going on, and he's probably going to have an answer to what happened to those that disappeared, whatever it may be. It could be UFOs or who knows what, that he's going to be able to gain control of the world. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, in the mouth that spoke boastfully. So he's going to be a person. He's not a spirit. The Antichrist, he will be a spirit. He will ultimately be possessed by Satan himself. And he's going to speak very boastfully. If we go back into Isaiah chapter 14, and I think we've looked at this many times, but we look at kind of a description of Satan and what his objectives are. And just starting in verse 14 of Isaiah 14, we won't go through all of them, but his goal, actually let's start in 13, I will ascend, this is Satan speaking, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. See, Satan has always desire to be worshipped as though he is God himself. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. And that's what we see as we go into a description of the Antichrist over in Daniel chapter 7, that it says he will speak boastfully. Well, it's going to get to the point midway through the tribulation where he is going to expect to be worshipped as though he's Jesus Christ. Remember, he's Antichrist. He's in place of, he's against, he's going to be in place of Jesus Christ. And so he is going to ultimately, under the direction of the false prophet, and that's where the mark of the beast comes in, is that the expectation is that people associate themselves with Antichrist in some fashion, and that he is worshipped, and those that don't will be killed, or will likely be very unlikely to survive the tribulation. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and this is getting to the thrones of God. And just take a look at Revelation chapter 4 real quick. In verse 5. This is a picture, actually let's just start in verse 1, of the throne in heaven. After I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." So here's a picture of John, the receiver of the revelation of Jesus Christ, beginning in chapter 4, told to come up to heaven. And from heaven he will witness everything that's taking place on the earth, the tribulation, the judgment phase. And we'll get into it when we talk about the rapture, but John represents the church. In the first 3 chapters of Revelation, we see reference to the church something like 19 times. When John goes up to heaven to watch what's going on in the earth, we see no reference to the church whatsoever until the tribulation is over and we get to Revelation 19. So what does that mean? That means the church is gone. It's gone before we get to Revelation 6, which is the start of the tribulation. As I was at once I was in the Spirit, and there before me excuse me, was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one that sat there had the appearance of jasper and ruby. A rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones. That's what, remember, we just saw in Daniel 7. It's not just the throne, but it's the thrones. And seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their head. And that's probably a reference to the church. That's probably a reference to the church, the 24 elders. From the throne came flashes of lightning. You know, oftentimes when you read about God throughout the scriptures, we see references to fire and lightning, which gets to his majesty and his superiority. Rumblings and pearls of thunder. In front of the throne, 7 lamps were blazing. These are the 7 spirits of God. And so what we see here is a picture coming from the throne, depicted obviously metaphorically as flashes of lightning. So if we go back to Daniel 7, and we get to verse 9, thrones were set in place. So this is talking about future kingdoms, including the ultimate kingdom of God, the ultimate kingdom that Jesus is going to eventually rule over on earth. In the Ancient of Days, this is a reference to God the Father, who is often referred to as the Eternal One and also the Judge of the earth. His clothing was white as snow, his hair was on his head was white as wool, which probably represents his infinite wisdom and so forth. His throne was, there we go, flaming with fire, kind of the same description we just saw in Revelation 5, which talks about his holiness and his purity. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. And we see his picture of fire coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. Thousands upon thousands, according to most scholars, are the angels that will be attending God at that time. But then it says 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was sealed and the books were opened. This is probably a reference to the white throne, great white throne judgment, when he is going to judge all of those whose names are not recorded in the Lamb's Book of Life. Then I continued to watch because the boastful words, there we go, boastful again, I'm going to be like the Most High, of the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. Turn to Revelation 19.
What verse?
Looking for it here. Okay. Verse 16. Let's actually go to where it talks about Antichrist and false prophet being thrown into the lake of fire. I should have it right here in front of me, but I can't seem to find it.
But isn't it down towards 19, 20?
Yeah.
There, 21.
Okay, yeah, verse 20, good, thank you. In verse 20, it says, the beast, which is Antichrist, was captured, and with it the false prophet. So the false prophet will, as we get back into Revelation 13, he'll be this false religious leader who will support and lead people to follow Antichrist. But it says, with it the false prophet who had performed the signs on his behalf. With these signs he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. And so here we have, Jesus comes back and he immediately throws Antichrist and the false prophet, not into Hades or Sheol or whatever, but directly into the lake of fire. They are the first two that will physically occupy the lake of fire. And then we see 1,000 years later, Satan is also thrown into the lake of fire, where Antichrist and the false prophet are still existing. So 1,000 years and they're still there. So that gets to the eternal nature of heaven and hell. They'll still be there 1,000 years later. So if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, verse 11, I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and what? Thrown into the blazing fire, which confirms what Revelation confirms what we read here. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. So we have the Ancient of Days, which is God the Father, and now the Son of Man. And Jesus was often referenced or referred to, he referred to himself as the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven, exactly like we read in Revelation 19, that he's going to come back. He's going to physically return with multitudes, with armies coming back with him. Guess who's coming back with him? Those of us that have gone to be with him. Patty, you're coming back. You have got nothing to worry about. So we're coming back with him. So here we see. So we see it's interesting here. He,
I like horses.
the Son of Man, approached, so God the Son approached God the Father and was led into his presence. He was given, and he already has the authority. This is a picture of Jesus being given authority, glory, sovereign power. All nations, peoples, and every language worshipped him. So this is a reference to the millennial kingdom, when Jesus is going to rule and reign in perfect righteousness for 1,000 years on earth and then into the eternal state. His dominion, Jesus' dominion, when he comes back, he's going to rule the earth. And we're told that we're going to rule and reign with him. So he's going to give us responsibilities. We're not just going to be sitting around and sitting in a cloud playing a harp. We're going to be busy ruling and reigning with Jesus Christ under his authority. And he's going to rule the world in perfect righteousness during that period of time. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. We have all these kingdoms. You got, started with Egypt, and then the Babylonians, and the Mede-Persians, and the Greeks, and then the Romans. And as we read way over in Daniel chapter 2, that rock cut without hands will smash the feet of that statue, and the statue will collapse, and just the remnants, the little shards, or they'll be like chaff, like wheat chaff. It'll just blow away and cease to exist. There'll be no no semblance of any kind of world institutions anymore. That'll all be under Jesus Christ, and that's what's going to happen when he comes back. Then it goes on to say, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind and disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all of this. So now he gets into the interpretation, or kind of, everybody got just a few more minutes?
Yep.
Or we want to quit? Well, let's just go. We'll go another 4 minutes. It goes on to tell him what the dream that he had meant. And it's basically what we said here. The four great beasts are the four kings that will rise from the earth. And so if you try to wrap your mind around the fact that here is Daniel, still a part of the Babylonian Empire, accurately seeing the coming of all the major world empires, including the 10-member nation. So we know that, yeah, there was a Mede-Persian Empire, there was a Greek Empire, there was a Roman Empire. It's all historically confirmed. We know that Daniel saw this vision and Nebuchadnezzar saw the same one before they came into existence. So what's that tell us about the 10-member nation? It's going to happen. And it's in the process now of coming together. The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people, not intrinsically holy, because none of us are intrinsically holy, but they have been made holy, of the Most High, will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. So many people wonder who the holy people are. Is it the church? I don't think it's the church. I think this is a reference to Jews that through the tribulation accept Christ. I think this is a reference to the holy people, the separate people. I think it's a reference to Jews. Not that the church is not important, but the church at this point in history had not come into existence. It was yet future. When we get to the rapture, we'll talk about the mystery of the church. So I think this is a reference to spirit-filled Jews. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast. He's fixated on Rome, and which was different than all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. You just read about the cruelty and the evil way that that the Roman Empire operated. You can see that that's exactly what was depicted here. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head. What's that all about? And about the other horn, Antichrist, that came up before, which 3 of them fell. A horn that looked more imposing than the others, had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. This is about the ability of the Antichrist to convince and to speak against everything, and to be boastful and to be worshipped under the influence as though he's the Most High. And then we'll finish with this, and then next week we'll continue on. As I watched, this horn, Antichrist, was waging war against the holy people and defeating them. So in other words, there are going to be people, holy people, Christians during the tribulation that he is going to defeat, that he is going to subdue and have executed. Now go to Revelation 13 real quick. In verse 7, here we are again. It was given power, Antichrist, to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority for every tribe, people, language, and nation. So here we have a picture of Antichrist that's going to wage war against Christians that exist during the tribulation. That's where we get into the mark of the beast, that those that don't take the mark are the ones that he's going to wage war, excuse me again. And he's going to have authority over every tribe, people, language, nations. In other words, the whole world. Christ is going to control the world and do everything in his power to wipe out Christians. Now, one last thing, and we'll finish with this. Go to Matthew chapter 16. We're way beyond my time. This is Jesus speaking in Matthew 16, verse 18. And I tell you, Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So what we see here is Jesus predicting or prophesying that in the near future, from when he wrote there, stated this, he is going to begin. Revelation 13, we see that Antichrist does, in fact, overcome believers. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that we're in the church. We're not the ones that are referenced in Daniel 7 or Revelation 13. The ones that are referenced there are people that will accept Christ during the tribulation, right? So there's a distinction. The church, we're in the church age. We'll talk about that when we get to Daniel 9. We're in the church age. Satan does not have power. He can certainly oppress us, but he's not going to overcome us. But he does during the tribulation. So just a kind of an interesting point that there's a distinction. And another thing that kind of gets to the whole issue of a pre-tribulational rapture, that the rapture is intended for the church, as we'll see when we get to the rapture, and we're going to be gone. But after the rapture occurs and tribulation starts, it says that multitudes will accept Christ during the tribulation. Those are the ones that Antichrist will overcome or defeat, at least temporarily. Of course, they'll all be resurrected when Jesus comes back. Okay, comments, questions?
Yeah, I have a comment. In Matthew 16, 8, is this referring to, my question would be, is this referring to what we've talked about of food? Be aware of their discussion. Jesus asked, "You of little faith, why are you talking amongst yourself about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets full you gathered?" And it goes on. Is that referring to what we just talked about food? Should we not be worried?
No, this is just simply Jesus saying, you have a very short memory, talking to his disciples. You know,
Okay.
don't you remember when I fed the 5,000,
Right.
which was really probably 12,000, because it
Right.
just talks about the men.
Mhm.
But don't you remember that? I mean, you of little faith, how you forget? You know, that's
But don't
entirely.
you think that,
That's
that
today
he's
too.
speaking to us and saying, don't worry, you of little faith?
Well, yeah,
we're
I see
gonna
your
be
point
fed,
there, yeah.
you
Yeah, I
know?
think, yeah, that's probably the case, sure. Yeah, you have little faith. In
That's
other words,
tremendously
we don't
comforting.
need to worry.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
don't need to worry. And it just seems to me that that's a confirmation to us
I
of
think
what we
that-
just
yeah.
were talking about.
I see your point.
In part, but if you look at the entire context
Yeah.
of that, he's chastising them over previous statements that they have made. So always you have to read the entire section in order to be able to understand what's being
But
said here.
aren't we guilty of doing that same thing?
Yeah, but that's different from about whether we're gonna be fed or not, cause you know, to Bob's point, yeah, it's telling us God's gonna take care of us, but the
Right.
context here is such that that's not what the discussion
It
is
doesn't need
about.
to be food, but he's saying, one of little faith, that he's gonna take care of us, whatever it is, whether it's
Yeah,
food or medical or whatever we wanna say.
Well, the context is, don't fall for the lies of religious leaders that don't know what they're talking about.
right,
That's what the context is
Okay.
there.
yeah,
So you've gotta read it within that set.
yeah.
You know, there's a lot about the tribulation and everything, but as Christians, knowing we're gonna be raptured, how concerned are we about what's going on in the tribulation? You know, because we're not gonna be here, we're not gonna suffer. Is the purpose of having that there for us to study, so we can share and disciple, so people know, this is not gonna be a fun time for you, I'm escaping.
Good
But-
point.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think we talk about it because it's in the Bible. You know, that
Right.
virtually the entire Old Testament in one way or another talks in some fashion or another about the tribulation, so we talk about it and kind of what's leading up to it. But yeah, I think it's to let people know that don't think that you're just gonna skate through that. It's not gonna
but
be.
it also gives us comfort.
Yeah.
Right.
But
We're
it
gonna be
also
here.
shows other people that judgment is gonna be made.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And hopefully, they find their way before.
Correct, yeah, cause if
You
we had to
know?
focus on that, that'd be scary, but we don't,
Well,
you
but
know?
we should be scared for them.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what you're,
That's
that's what you're
that's
saying.
why
Right,
this is here,
right.
is because
Yeah,
And
you know,
that's-
Spread the word.
We had a discussion about J.D. Farag earlier today, and some like him and some don't like him, but he's got a point that you can't ignore. We are on a rescue mission right
Yes.
now to save as many people
Yeah.
as we possibly can from that time of tribulation.
Yeah.
Because if you become, there's people, well, I'll wait, if I see it happen, then I'll become a believer. You're gonna lose your head.
Yeah,
Okay, if you're a believer before, you're gonna get raptured away, you're gonna have a wonderful meal up in heaven. I mean, things are gonna be really, really good. If you
Yeah.
wait and say, well, when it happens, then I'll believe, you just lost your head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Literally,
Yep.
just lost your head. Which avenue do you wanna go? And oh, by the way, if you're not willing to live for Christ now when it's easy, what in the world makes you think you're gonna be willing to lose your life when it's hard?
yeah.
well,
Which
and the
also
other
puts
thing
to
is-
the fact of the hardening, which has happened to the Jewish people right now, is gonna flip and turn to the Gentiles, us, that are believers or on the fence of whether or not, when I see it, I'll believe it and I'll accept. No, you're gonna be just like Pharaoh.
You'll
Too
be-
long.
You'll be
Well, we
turned,
do-
you'll be turned over to your own desires at that point,
the t-
and it'll
it's
be too
going,
late.
Because you know,
once the church is gone, the Holy Spirit's gone. So for them to want to believe after they've heard it, they may still have the deception and not,
And there's nothing you can do with
Yeah, well,
that.
the Holy
Yeah,
Spirit,
right.
let's
Gonna
make
struggle.
sure we clarify that the Holy Spirit's not gone, he's just gone in the form he's in now,
Yeah.
right,
which is indwell.
yeah.
The Holy Spirit's always here.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
He'll be here, but
Yeah.
he will not indwell
indwell.
the church
yes.
like he does today. It'll be
Well,
different.
I was reading a thing, and I don't know where, on the Muslims coming in and sneaking into our church. I don't know how else to put it. But they were saying that the numbers, and you almost wonder if that's the Antichrist that is
No,
coming
I don't think
to
that the
destroy.
Antichrist would be a Muslim, because no Jew would ever enter into any kind of peace agreement with a Muslim. Just wouldn't happen.
Oh.
In that line, quick question, back to the Iran and whatnot with the nuclear stuff. And the way pieces seem to be falling into place, with Iran now getting its way with the nuclears, could that be something where the Damascus gets obliterated forever? If they move nuclear material there, Israel blows it up to stop it, it makes a perfect sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't speculate as to how it's gonna happen. All I know is it's gonna happen. Because Damascus will be totally destroyed.
And never inhabited again.
Yeah, yeah.